As most people know, the Civil Rights Movement was an organized effort by African Americans to end racial discrimination and gain equal rights. In 1948, Harry Truman issued an executive order to end segregation in the armed services. Segregation was among the major problems that existed during the Civil Rights Movement. Grassroots civil rights activists wanted to be seen as equal. This included not being forced to use colored bathrooms, water fountains, and more. Racial segregation was also a problem in schools. In 1954, a court case, Brown versus the Board of Education, took place, with the outcome turning out to be in favor of the Board of Education. All schools after this remained segregated. In the next year, in 1955, segregation was still a major problem, and one of the civil rights leaders, Rosa Parks, refused to give up her seat to a white man on a Montgomery, Alabama bus. Her defiant stance prompted the year-long Montgomery bus boycott. 2 years later, in 1957, Martin Luther King Jr., along with 5 other black pastors and civil rights leaders, met in Atlanta, Georgia, to coordinate a nonviolent protest against racial discrimination and segregation. He believed that peaceful protests were the answer to what they were going through. During the same year, 9 black students, known as the Little Rock Nine, were blocked from integrating into Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. President Dwight Eisenhower eventually had to send federal troops to escort students, but they were still harassed after. Right after that event took place, on September 9, 1957, President Eisenhower signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957 into law. This act was to help protect voter rights. 2 years passed and not much has changed. Along with everything that happened so far, police brutality was also taking place. Because of the resistance from people, police used fire hose, dogs, and weapons to control African Americans. The next few years, things got much worse. In 1963, 1 month after Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech on September 15, 1963, some supporters of Jim Crow laws and the Ku Klux Klan bombed 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. This bombing killed 4 young girls and injured several other people. The bombing fueled several angry protests. Malcolm X, unlike Martin Luther King Jr., believed that African Americans should fight back physically instead of having gentle, nonviolent protests. Malcolm X, along with the Black Panther Party, did exactly that and fought back against the government, police, and the Ku Klux Klan. To calm things down a bit, in 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prevented employment discrimination due to race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. A year later, Malcolm X was assassinated on February 21, 1965. After that, things began to calm down a little bit and got better. On August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to prevent the use of literary tests as a voting requirement. Sadly, 2 years later, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. After that, in the same year, President Johnson finally signed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, providing equal housing opportunity regardless of race, religion, or national origin. In the end, what seemed like a dual effort between grassroots civil rights activists and civil rights reformers in the federal government to put an end to racial discrimination and gain equal rights was simply just not the case. Grassroots civil rights activists fought long and hard with little help from the government to accomplish the one goal of having true civil rights.